persecuted, etc. And they were the Beatitudes, if you remember, or the blessings. And then Jesus started into those 6 extensions, that we call them, the ones that start with, you have heard it said, but now I say this. Kyle covered the first 4 of them over the past few weeks. And today I'm going to be digging into the next one, which is an eye for an eye. And then next week we'll finish that 6th one with loving your neighbor, maybe the most difficult one of all. So a few weeks ago when I was preaching on the Beatitudes, I asked you to picture a stairway. And do you remember that and envision that Jesus was teaching his audience lessons that would enable them to climb kind of step by step, higher and higher on that stairway to the kingdom of heaven? Remember that? If we look at the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, we get a visual of where we are on that stairway as we look at today's message. So let's just take a look on the screen. You got that there, Edith? All right, I'll just carry on. We could probably. Great, just to the next slide. There we go. That's kind of the mountain with the stairway idea. So this is a depiction of the Sermon on the Mount with chapter 6, halfway through the body, being the very top. Today we're at eye for eye. Next week we're going to reach the apex of that Sermon on the Mount. And then over the coming weeks, we'll actually begin kind of descending down the other side to the conclusion of Jesus' sermon. Okay, so I hope that kind of clarifies this pathway that we've been following in the series for the last couple of months. So an eye for an eye is found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. We read it earlier, but let's read it again for context. It says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." So I don't know about y'all, but when I read my Bible, I sometimes get confused. I kind of go in expecting one thing, but sometimes what I read seems to contradict what I expect. And I think this eye for eye section is a good example of that for me. And because as I read this, I think retaliation, revenge, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, limb for limb. You know, then it goes on to suggest that we shouldn't resist an evil person, but be kind of like a doormat maybe and let people walk all over us. And then it says, if they take your shirt, give them your coat. They force you to walk 1 mile, go with them 2. Right? When I read this, I don't like the way it sounds. I don't know about how all y'all were brought up, but my wife Kelly and I were both brought up under the law of, you better not start the fight, but you better finish it, right? Anybody else like that? I think a lot of us are kind of like that. You know, human nature makes a lot of this stuff really hard for us to react in that way. And these last 2 sections are probably the most challenging parts of the entire Sermon on the Mount. And if you're anything at all like me, you probably feel pretty confused sometimes by how unachievable some of Jesus' teachings are in this sermon. But what I've found as I've been studying this and reading this is that when I'm confused by what the Bible is saying, it's usually God forcing me to do one of 2 things: read deeper or change my attitude. And I think these verses give me the opportunity to do both of those. So I want to talk a bit about revenge, because that's really what an eye for an eye is, right? It's a vengeful act, and we know from human history that revenge, retaliation, it just permeates this world. And if we take these verses, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, at face value, they seem to justify taking revenge for being harmed, right? And as human beings, we have this instinctive reaction when it comes to being harmed, and it's to strike back. You know, any parent or grandparent can attest to that, I'm sure. Kelly and I have 3 grandchildren, And they are all three amazing little examples of humanity. And it's a pure joy for us to see them learn and discover about their new world. But in the process of their learning, we get to witness their true human nature. And anybody that's had children knows that all of them, doesn't matter how cute, how adorable they are, all of them are natural-born liars, cheats, and thieves. Right? There's nothing unnatural about that. It's just the way we all start out, is we have to learn that there is a better way than to just follow our urges and our instincts. But the lessons are hard. They're hard learned at those ages particularly, right? It seems easier to lie to your parents than to face the music for what you did, right? It seems easier to cheat rather than taking the chance of maybe losing. You know, it's easier for a kid to steal a toy from another kid. That's instant gratification. It just seems easier. But there's another side to our human nature, too, that God inbred into us, and it's that we don't like to be lied to. And we don't like to be cheated or stolen from. And when those things happen to us, we instinctively want to strike back. And if you think about human history, it's just rife with horrible, appalling counts of striking back and what can result from it. Retaliation and revenge have caused some of the most horrific events in world history. Think about terrorism. Terrorist attacks are revenge, but with escalation, right? For often nothing more than an ideal. War is retaliation or greed for territory, right? Murder is a response to anger. They're all examples of striking back, but more often than not, they're an escalation of the original offense. I remember growing up in my hometown, and there was a rivalry with the neighboring town, and there used to be rumbles at the rec center on the weekends to prove whose town was tougher, right? They started as just fist fights, but at the next rumble, somebody brought a knife, and this is a true story, and a kid got stabbed, okay? And then the next week, another kid brought a gun. And I can't remember if anybody got shot. I don't think so, but it happened, and it escalated. And that's gang violence. You know, if we look at mob violence, it's the same escalation. War in the Middle East. It's going on for thousands and thousands of years just to get revenge for something that happened way, way back when. And what's really sad is that this is only a short list of the atrocities that have occurred in our world, all in the name of revenge. And that's what Jesus is addressing here in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's man's nature to desire retribution. But Jesus is making it clear that there's a better way. There's a better way. He says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. It's in Matthew 4:17. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. Stop doing what you're doing. Turn around. There's a better way. And it's not retaliation or revenge. I don't know about you, but eye for eye, tooth for tooth sounds like retaliation to me. Do not resist an evil person? You know, what's that about? So if Jesus doesn't stand for revenge or retaliation, if he doesn't stand for laying down and being abused, what is it that he's saying here in these lines? So there must be something deeper in here, and there is, and it's found in the context of the ancient Jewish culture. Now, it's always so important that when we read biblical accounts that we think in terms of what the author was trying to communicate to his audience, right? Not to us. Jesus wasn't speaking to us on that mountain, right? He was speaking to his audience in their language, and it's our job, it's my job to try to interpret what he's saying, but in a way that we can all understand, right? So we're reading this in English. Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, Hebrew dialect, and then poor Matthew is writing this all down in Greek. So it's pretty easy for the message to be literally lost in translation here. Now, personally, I love hermeneutics. That's the study of translation. And some of you are probably starting to notice that I kind of like exploring the context of some of these verses. For me, I'm a visual learner, so I like digging into the Greek and the Hebrew text and learning about how these ancient Jewish people lived and how they thought and what was their experience in their time. I want to know what it meant to them when Jesus said, well, you've heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. I want to know it from them. So I thought this morning, let's go back in time and picture what this part of the Sermon on the Mount meant to the people as they listened to Jesus teaching it. And if you're a Jew in Jesus' time, you would have grown up with Torah, or Jewish law. You can think 10 Commandments here, all the thou shalt nots and whatnot. Those are the laws that Moses brought down on the tablets. Most of us are familiar with the first 10. But by the end of Torah, there were actually 613 of these commandments. And the Jewish people, the Israelites, had been living by these for over 1,000 years. And little by little, the original intent had become blurry. And over the years, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were beginning to distort the message of Torah. So this entire section of the Sermon on the Mount is like Jesus, he's setting the people straight on their understanding of Torah, sort of a reset and reminding them of why these laws were still important, and then clarifying them to them. If you remember a few weeks ago, Kyle spoke, he preached on the fulfillment of the law, where Jesus said he was not here to abolish the law, but he was here to fulfill it, right? And here in the sermon, he's fulfilling it by explaining to them what the intent of the law was in the first place. And really, the intent was simple. It was simply to maintain order and civility amongst the Israelite nation. And that's why he started all these lessons with something like, you've heard it said, referring to Torah, but now I tell you, blah, 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 blah. So he's drawing them into this understanding that what they thought they knew was actually wrong. And that through 3 simple examples that these people would be all familiar with, he would teach them what was right. Okay? So those 613 commandments were God's law for the Israelite nation. But the legal system of the Jewish people that lived under the law was based on something else. So it gets kind of complicated. You see, they had to juggle living Torah within the overall law of the land. And the law of the land, when it came to retaliation, was based on the Latin word lex talionis. So you see lex is law in Latin, talionis is retaliation. So it was the law of retaliation, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, simply meant under lex talionis, the punishment shouldn't be any greater than the crime. The response to being mistreated should be no greater than the original mistreatment. So the intent of lex talionis was to prevent this escalation we've been talking about and give a measured response to a crime. And it would always be a judge that applied the law to the situation. It wouldn't be the victim taking vengeance, right? And we see this in Leviticus 19, verse 18. The law specifically states, quote, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself." So the law wasn't about a physical act of retribution, an eye for an eye. And there's actually no biblical account whatsoever of this physical penalty ever being carried out. The actual legal penalty that would have been carried out was under lex talionis would have been a monetary compensation to make up for it. It wouldn't be you who decided what your eye was worth or what cost. Lex talionis gave that authority to a judge. Okay, so in effect, what Jesus is teaching here is he's saying, don't take justice into your own hands because you'll make it worse. Leave it to God. He'll sort it out. And it says so in Deuteronomy. So chapter 32, verse 35, it says, "It is mine to avenge," that is God. "I will repay, not you." So that's just a little context to better understand the legal system and sort of at the time and how eye for eye was meant to be applied in those days. And then Jesus goes on in verse 39 to explain how we should go about responding when we're mistreated. And he uses these 3 simple examples. He said, don't only take justice into your own hands. I tell you, do not resist an evil person, he says. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. That's kind of confusing. It sounds like he's saying just let evil happen. Don't oppose it. Just be a doormat, right? But that's not what he means here. What he does mean, again, kind of boils down to the understanding of the Greek. And the Greek word used here for resist, as in do not resist an evil person, it's anthistemi, and its root, anti, means against, okay? Histemi is to stand, okay? So if you use these together, it is to stand against. So this verse is saying, do not stand against an evil person. And so it's describing a face-to-face confrontation. And so what Jesus is saying is don't get into a face-to-face battle with an evil person. Don't resist in kind. It doesn't mean don't respond. It just means don't respond by standing face-to-face and fighting evil with evil, because that doesn't work. It only escalates. But then Jesus goes on and he describes what we should do when we're faced with an evil person. And if we look in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 15, it says, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Right? So here the Apostle Paul is kind of dragging the Old Testament law into the New Testament command to love your neighbor. It's a beautiful thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for those of you who don't know, he was a German pastor, anti-Nazi dissident, and he was quoted as saying, evil becomes a spent force when we put up no resistance. I'll just say it again. Evil becomes a spent force when we put up no resistance. And I'll bet Bonhoeffer learned that from Sermon on the Mount, from Jesus. So let's imagine a scene to illustrate Jesus' first example here, okay? Maybe you're an Israelite farmer, you're taking your crop to the market, and a tax collector stops you. Let's name him Zacchaeus. Okay, remember him? Little Zacchaeus? He was that one that everybody hated because he was pilfering from everybody and keeping it for himself, right? So he comes up to you demanding more than you have to give, more than you owe. And when you resist, with everybody watching, he slaps you on your right cheek, okay? In those days, it had a really significant meaning. If you kind of do some mental gymnastics, you'll picture Zacchaeus using his right hand, his dominant hand, and he's slapping your right cheek. So it would be a backhanded slap to the right cheek. And in their culture, a backhanded slap to the right cheek was specifically meant to publicly shame and humiliate and show the victim in front of everybody that he was inferior. And as if that's not bad enough, Jesus then says, well, turn him the other cheek, also. And I'm like, come on, Jesus, you gotta be kidding. This can't be right. I've just been publicly humiliated, and you want me to take that again in front of everybody? And I think Jesus would say, yeah. And I think if he was here, he'd tell us why. And the why is because when we turn the other cheek in that culture, it accomplished two things. The first is we're showing concern in a way for Zacchaeus by saying, essentially, if humiliating me is so important to you, go ahead, hit me again, because it means nothing to me. Hit me again. My value comes from God, not from you. So go ahead, hit me again, be satisfied. Okay? And the second thing that you accomplish in that culture, it's another sort of subtlety of ancient Jewish culture. You see, a slap to the left cheek is with an open hand. And that was considered at the time to be a provocation between equals. Kind of interesting. You see what's happening here. So offering the other cheek is actually asserting equality between you and Zacchaeus. It elevates you to equal status with him. It's resistance, but it's not resistance in kind, right? And in doing this, you sort of just turn the table on your evildoer. It's pretty clever. James Baldwin was a U.S. civil rights activist, and he had a famous saying, and he said, if I'm not who you say I am, then you're not who you think you are. Yeah, I'll repeat that. If I'm not who you say I am, then you're not who you think you are. Right? Take that, Zacchaeus, right? And then the next example that Jesus uses is that of being sued for your tunic. And we find that in verse 40. It says, if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. So all three of these examples that we're looking at today they have to do with the law, except for the last one. They have to do with the law. This one is fairly similar to the first in that there's some legal precedent here that says if you take your neighbor's coat, you must give it back before nightfall. Exodus 22, verses 26 to 27 says this, if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? So you see, in this example, we're seeing this victim being sued for his tunic, which to us would have been his shirt, okay? He can't be sued for his cloak, basically, because it would just have to give it back at the end of the day, so that wouldn't be any good. But he can sue this poor guy for his shirt. And in that day, the guy would probably only have one shirt and one coat because they were so valuable at the time, right? So if someone is suing you for your shirt, you're basically left standing pretty much naked with the exception of this cloak. And here Jesus is suggesting, he's saying, if this evildoer is so insensitive and unfeeling as to leave you standing in the court, humiliated, then give him the satisfaction of offering your coat also. Now the risk is if he takes that too, you're literally standing naked in the court, so hopefully that doesn't happen. So, but again, this is kind of an attempt to turn the tables on the evildoer. The peasant is saying, you, sir, obviously need this so much more than I do. Don't only take my shirt. Can I offer you my coat too? And I think anybody watching this in that court would see the irony here. It's the turning of the cheek, again, to reuse that term. The one who is most in need or injured sacrifices himself a little bit further so that the one of lesser need is truly confronted with the unfairness that he's perpetrating. It's brilliant. It's the evil one being confronted with his own evilness. Do not resist evil with evil, as you remember. And the next and the last of the three examples Jesus uses, that going of the extra mile. In verse 41, it says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. So the context of this one is in Roman law, a soldier had a right to conscript any citizen he chose to carry his equipment for him. But the lawmakers knew that if that was to happen, there had to be a maximum distance for this, right? Or the soldiers would just take advantage. So there was a 1 mile limit placed in the law, and in that day it was 1,000 steps. Okay? So remember that this was occupied territory, and I'm guessing there's plenty of soldiers doing this every day, on any given day. And the message here that Jesus is going to teach is, once again, completely countercultural, right? So imagine this is you. You know, you're working on your farm, and here comes a troop of soldiers marching down the street, and you get picked to carry all the gear of one of these soldiers. You're going to be upset. You're going to be mad. You're going to be angry. But Jesus is saying, don't respond with anger. Don't validate the disgrace. Turn it around. Turn the table on the situation by showing generosity instead. At the end of your 1,000 steps, look at that soldier in the face. Smile at him. Graciously offer him another 1,000 steps. Imagine how the conversation would be during that 2nd mile. The soldier is going to be completely disarmed, right? He'd be completely taken off guard. And Kelly and I do some marriage facilitation and counseling, and one of the techniques we use that we were taught when a couple is in conflict is, it's an acronym, and it's CORE, C-O-R-E. It stands for cooperation, ownership, respect, and empathy. The idea being, if 2 people are in conflict, so a Roman soldier, peasant farmer, if 2 of those can bring 1 or more of those things into a conversation, that conversation will take on a completely different vibe, right? That Roman soldier is going to be completely disarmed. In the 2nd mile, he's being confronted by a farmer, a peasant who's willing to cooperate and show respect and show some empathy in going that extra mile just for him, the Roman soldier. That's pretty creative thinking. And that's the way Jesus wants us to think in our everyday lives. So I'm going to wrap this up here. There was final example. I know I told you there'd be 3, but there's actually 4. It's in verse 42, and it says, "Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." And what Jesus is saying, what he's saying here is, don't question. Just give. So this one's a little different than the first 3 in that it doesn't require a physical act or law, but it's more of a heartfelt state of just desiring to fulfill the needs of those that are lesser social standing maybe. You know, it's offering a leg up. It's giving of yourself to the benefit of another. It's sort of a perfect example to apply to our missional community groups that we're getting into this fall and winter. And Jesus is urging us to not only turn the other cheek and go the extra mile, he's saying, recognize those that need your help and respond to them by granting them what you can, by what God has blessed you with. And it may be your time, it may be your talent, or possibly your treasure, right? Possibly your treasure. And that's missional community thinking. It's fellowship with a heart for doing things differently. And that's what Jesus always teaches, cultural shift. Cultural shift in thinking from putting ourselves first to recognizing others as worthy of our love. And I'll just close this out with a quote from one of the best Jesus followers of our time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He summed it up when he said, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." I'd like to invite us all to reflect over those words this week and in the coming months. It's a perfect setup for next week's sermon, which we're just going to elevate it one more step, loving our enemies. And that's a tough one. So let's pray. Father God, thank you for your precious lessons wrapped up in your word. Let us leave here today with a heart for others and a meekness, not a weakness, for treating those who harm us with love rather than